Yeah, just letting our audience know that the session will be recorded from this point on. If anyone does not agree with the recording, you may exit the program. If you continue with the program, you hereby accept our terms, which include our ability to publish the recording on our social media, including our YouTube channel. Thank you.
Well, we've just watched an interview with Jihan Al-Farah, who is also involved with the Palestine History Tapestry Project, interviewing Omar Al-Akkad, who is with us today. We're so honored to have you. And we're here to just be an informal conversation with you about your book, One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This, which was released in February of this year. You know, Omar, I think the most powerful thing that I'm taking out of this this interview and others that I've read is that your book it opened up a space for people to acknowledge and have their experience of horror affirmed, given the lack of mainstream media coverage on the genocide in Palestine. And so I wonder, just, you know, as a writer, as a journalist, as a writer, you have now entered the world of the arts, which is something that we do here through the Palestine Museum. And I want you to just talk about how reaching people through the arts is different than how we reach people through mainstream media or institutions or our regular daily lives in the workplace. And I would just wonder if you could talk about why and how the arts offer a different way into people's heads and hearts, especially on this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was doing this event in I think it was just outside Boston a few months ago, and at the signing line afterwards, this young woman came up to me, and she looked about as terrified as anyone I have ever met in person. She was physically shaking, and she was crying. And, you know, obviously we're talking, I'm asking her what's wrong. And she was a graduate student. She was a colleague of that student who was snatched up in an unmarked van after she wrote that op-ed about you know, pushing for boycotts and divestment and sanctions. And she was telling it was her first time going out to something since that had happened, and she was terrified because she was convinced that she was next, right? I mean, this is the effect that every authoritarian regime has or intends to have when they do something like this. You can't arrest everybody, can't throw everybody in jail, but you do it strategically enough, and the ripple effect goes outwards, and sort of that effect of fear. And I was thinking about this in the context of you know, this book this book I wrote is you know, I often say I don't think it's going to be remembered, but if it's going to be remembered, it's going to be remembered as one of the tamest examples of its kind. It'll be thought of as quaint compared to the level of rage that I'm seeing. But that it has created these spaces is at once this thing that has been incredibly gratifying for me, but is also so incredibly depressing, right? that this is the one spot, right, where you can feel, even for a moment, like you're not losing your mind. But I think with respect to the arts, and this I think is true of fiction more than nonfiction, believing that a group of human beings have no stories to tell is, I think, a prerequisite for every other facet of dehumanization leading up to the extreme end of the spectrum, which is the active act of exterminating a people. You have to begin with this notion that there are no stories to be told here. And so, like earlier this morning, I was on a podcast where I was asked for reading recommendations. And of course, I want to talk about Muhammad al-Kurd's book, and I want to talk about all the Halaylan's, the brilliant pieces of nonfiction that have come out just in the last year or two. But the first one I always go to is Minor Detail by Adanya Shibli, which is still my novel of the decade, my novel of the last 10 years. Because I think it's such a short, sharp example of brilliant storytelling that is so rooted in the reality of what is happening and what has been happening for so long. So I'm very much engaged with this notion that the narrative battle, if that's how you want to think about it, is not confined to this cold reciting of facts. Because on a factual basis, every facet of this is obvious. Every facet of this occupation and now active part of the genocide is blatant. There's something else about storytelling. And I think that's the reason that it's the only thing I'm any good at. So naturally I'm going to gravitate in that direction. But I think it's believing that a people have no stories to tell is such a prerequisite for every other facet of dehumanization. So I tend to start there. It doesn't work a lot of the time, but that tends to be my starting point.
Well, and you spoke in this interview about how journalism at its best is telling a story that some people somewhere don't want to hear. And I wonder if you could talk about the ways in which independent media is perhaps doing a better job of shedding light on the Palestinian story and the context of how we got here. Something that mainstream media often overlooks or intentionally ignores.
Yeah, I mean, one of the many, many infuriating aspects of the last 2 years has been the fact that, I come from a journalism background, so obviously I'm going to spend a lot of my time thinking about journalism. But it comes from the fact that I haven't just seen the worst journalism of my lifetime over the last 2 years. I've seen some of the best journalism. And almost all of it has come from Palestinian journalists, most of whom are now dead, precisely because they committed acts of journalism. And so I think, the leverage that institutional media has is largely of scale. The New York Times gets to go into the halls of power in a way that no independent reporter can. There's no seats assigned to those independent reporters in the White House spokesperson's briefing room or whatever. That doesn't exist. And so you are naturally, if you're working for one of these independent outlets, and there's a lot that I'm very much a fan of, but if you're working for these outlets, you quite simply don't have that level of access. And obviously that is detrimental in some senses, but it's also incredibly useful in others because you don't become a part of that machine in the same way. And so, I always come back to the same thing. With respect to all journalists, independent, major media, the BBC, whatever, I don't care. I always come back to the same thing. Think about how you would write this story in a vacuum if you weren't worried about external pressures, advertisers, so on and so forth, editors, the lobby groups that are going to yell at you, and how you would write this story if those pressures are in place and if they're not in place. And what's the gap between those two stories? How different is that story? Every journalist should be asking themselves that at all times. And I think the work that independent journalists have done over the last 2 years is at once a testament to the incredible courage it takes to tell the truth in a moment like this, but also an incredibly depressing indictment of the actual mechanisms of large-scale journalism, particularly in the Western world right now. Because why the hell is some guy with a cell phone camera and zero resources able to tell the story in a truer way than a newspaper with millions of dollars to spend. That shouldn't be the case if the world worked in anything resembling normal functioning.
Well, you talk about fear, that intentional instilling of fear on the general public, on journalists, the shutting down of the story. And, you know, we are fortunate in that way that through Instagram, through Substack, through, you know, these social media channels, that we are able to hear the story directly. You know, that's why people say this is a live stream genocide, because we have that direct access. Somebody can post, this is what's happening right now, and actually share pictures with us. And yeah, it is a huge shame on our current world that the courage comes from those who are under the most danger, and those of us who live in relative safety are still searching for their voice, for their courage. Many people still too afraid, you know, worried about the repercussions at work or in their families. And so to your conversation around courage is really very timely and telling and important.
Thank you. First of all, I should say that, you know, I've known myself for a long time. I'm one of the least courageous human beings on the planet. And I don't, you know, there's only one photo that I have in this office that I work in that's of a non-family member. It's of a Palestinian journalist. But I think one of the things I'm trying to get at when I talk about this subject in the broadest possible senses, you know, okay, you don't care about Palestinians, you don't care about what's happening. Oh, fine, let's the damage that has been done to mainstream media outlets, which are full of well-meaning, very talented journalists trying to do good work. But the damage that has been done over the last 2 years is just massive. It's massive. There's going to be an entire generation that doesn't trust this mechanism at all. And you can't just brush that aside. The other day I don't spend time on social media anymore, but I get CC'd in a lot of stuff as a result of this book. And I was CC'd in this argument between two people. And somebody had said something about the book, and then somebody responded saying this guy sucks, and the other one said why, and this person had a quote supposedly from me. I think it was about resistance or something, and it was not something I'd ever said or you know, something I'd ever written, but it became clear that what this person had done was go to ChatGPT and type in something like, tell me what Omar Lakad would have said about resistance or something like that, and then just took this and put it as a quote from me. This is the future we're hurtling towards, right? It's a future of noise, and you have to stand up against that. And having our central media apparatus be especially unhelpful in this moment is leading to something that is deeply, deeply terrifying to me in terms of simply being able to tell what the truth is anymore.
You know, you mentioned in the interview that Penguin Random House doesn't have anyone on their staff that speaks Arabic. And so I wonder if you want to just briefly talk about the publishing industry. I know when I published my memoir, which was just before October 7th in May of that year, I had a really hard time. I had a publisher back out of the deal at the last minute and had to scramble to find someone else. So I think we're in a different place with publishing on Palestine. There is heightened interest, but still, it's a challenging subject for I think the major publishing houses to address. But they did take you on, so I just wonder if you, as a writer, talk about that experience and how you think it compares to pre-October 7th, and where the publishing industry in general is headed, since that landscape is opening up to hybrid publishers and small publishing houses that sometimes, not always, have a little more courage to take on authors and get those stories out that are so important to tell.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's this famous story that I think every writer of Arab descent in the U.S. is familiar with, which is the story of excuse me, Edward Said in the 80s going around trying to convince the major publishers in New York to publish the work of Naguib Mahfouz, who at the time and probably still to this day is probably the most famous Arab writer in the modern era. And he's being rejected at every one of these publishing houses. And he's asking, I asked one of these publishers, like, why? This is really good literature. Why? And the publisher says something like, yeah, the writing is good and everything, but, Arabic is a really controversial language. And I think about that statement a lot, right? Like, what does it mean for a language to be controversial?
Right, the language itself.
Because it was a deeply honest statement, not in the way that the publisher probably intended, but it was a very telling statement about the nature of the machine you're trying to engage with. One of the really interesting things about the process for this book was that, I won the lottery with Knopf in terms of how supportive that house has been and that imprint has been. But when I say that, Knopf is an abstract entity. I'm talking about individual editors. My editor basically put a good chunk of his career on the line to get this book published. He pushed for it very, very hard. And he had leverage because, the first book he bought when he walked into that building ended up winning a National Book Award. So he had currency to spend, and he decided to spend it on this because he believed in it. And he's more responsible for this book than I am. But I can tell you at that first meeting, which would have been about a year and a half ago, there was a real sense of tension and anxiety in that room. You're sitting there with senior editors who buy books as a matter of course. It's not, and they run maybe the most prestigious imprint at the biggest publishing house in the country, and yet there's a real sense of anxiety, like what the hell are we getting ourselves into?
Sure.
And what has been quite interesting to see over the last few months is, this book comes out, it ends up being on the cover of the New York Times Book Review. It makes the bestseller list, and there's a change, and I can see it. I get these emails and I get call because at the end of the day, you're still in a commercial endeavor, and if you meet the benchmarks of commercial success of one kind or another, that always makes it a little bit easier. All of this stuff is mechanical and has nothing to do with the subject matter, but it's nonetheless a facet of the industry. And
well, it's a gatekeeping process.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why it comes back to what you said. Independent publishers are putting out some of the most vital work right now. Like some of the absolutely most vital work that a lot of these big publishers will not touch with a 10-foot pole. But you know what they're going to do? 20 years from now, they're going to publish reprints. They're going to publish.
Right. They're going to buy the rights.
Right. 20th anniversary
and act
edition.
like they were on the right side of history all along, right?
And there's going to be an intro in each one of these that talks about how it first came out from an obscure publisher, and it's going to be part of the lore, and all of that is coming. Of course.
And they
but
found
what
it.
indie publishers are doing right now is absolutely vital, because a lot of the big publishers have no guts with respect to this subject matter. That even something as tame as my book could render that much concern, and I understand it. I understand the moment we're in, but I also have a hard time believing that 10, 20 years down the line, we're not going to read a bunch of beautifully written novels about how terrible it was all the way back then.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about privilege because obviously most people who live in the West who are literally complicit and responsible for this genocide live in relative safety, and yet we're witnessing this moral bankruptcy of our leaders, the complacency, the complicity. There's a whole discussion I think we could have around power and powerlessness that are going on simultaneously. How do we, what do we do with that as individuals looking in from the outside?
A couple of answers come to mind. And I think they all have one thing in common, which I'll get to in a second, but in terms of a direct answer to your question, you know, I talk about this all the time now because it's a sort of mantra that I've been telling myself just to be able to get out of bed every day. And that's that nothing is enough, but everything matters.
Yeah.
You know, calling my elected representatives probably does nothing. But they have to log those phone calls. Showing up to the protests, maybe what actually happens is you get arrested and maybe no other change happens. But it lets the people who arrest you know that you're willing to be out there and get arrested. Donating, I think there's a line in the book about how no civilization, no society has ever donated or applauded its way out of a genocide. Nonetheless, there's people doing work on the ground. And the least I can do with whatever I have to spare is support those people who are doing the actual work. So all of those things at the most minute level are worth doing. You know,
for those who choose to want to do something, but there's also
the,
a whole segment of the population who actually have the privilege to not pay attention at all.
Yeah, and I mean, that's
we
what
bear
we're
witness
really
to that.
talking about. Like,
Yeah.
you know, and I said this in the other interview, right? Like the central hurdle here is there being no consequence to inaction. It's not the consequences of action; it's the lack of consequences of inaction. And I should say, there's people on every end of the spectrum, right? There's people chaining themselves to the gates of weapons manufacturers.
Exactly.
There's people doing the work in ways that I certainly am too cowardly to do. But all of this, I think, falls under the umbrella of having to have a conversation with yourself about how troublesome you are willing to be about this. Because
and what risk you're willing to take.
Exactly. The vast majority of people I've met where I live, it's not that they support this or are opposed to it. It's that they are opposed to anything that causes them awkwardness in their daily life. I
or makes
cannot
them
tell
uncomfortable.
you. Yeah, exactly. Like how many, you know, discomfort is the worst thing. Not your bloodline being wiped off the face of the earth, not your home being razed, no, discomfort. And I can't tell you how many literary organizations I have ruined my relationship with. Not because of the content of whatever I was standing for or against, but because I made things uncomfortable. And so you have to decide. That is the central thing. Everything flows from that point on. And if your decision is all I'm going to do is occasionally bring up the subject with my friends, great. That's where you are on the spectrum. And if yours is I'm going to go and I'm going to shut down these weapons manufacturers, that's where you stand. But you can't avoid having that conversation. I think once you do, then you can decide where you stand.
Ask a question. First of all, before I do that, thank you, Omar, for being with us. Apologize. My internet connection went down. I'm in Edinburgh, and I'm not used to that connections going down on me, and I had to reboot and all this. I also want to tell the audience if anybody would like to ask a question or a comment in person, I'm happy to bring you onto the panel. Please raise your hand if you want me to do that. Omar, you seem to have a unique insight into what's going on and a very powerful way of articulating that. Have you thought about having your own show or your own program about sharing your perspective with the world? It would seem to me that will be something will go over very big.
First of all, that's far more generous than I deserve. Thank you. Appreciate that. Um, I have this kind of curiosity that never goes away, and so I try everything once, sort of thing. Like and it just gets me in so much trouble because I'm not good at most things. In fact, I'm not really good at anything but writing. Um, I have no personal desire to take on that kind of role for a variety of reasons. One of which I don't think I would be good at it. The other being that there are far more necessary voices than mine. Um, Another being that I only know how to write, and so I want to write. That is the medium and the mode in which I am able to try to make sense of the world. Not actually make sense of the world, but try. Um,
There are very few people who are doing what you're doing and talking about what you're talking about, and there aren't enough of them. And I think that's really important. There's so many other people who are basically saying the wrong things and or not saying anything or when I listened to your conversation, I said, "Whoa, we must put this on." Because we need everybody in the world. And I'm sure the comments coming through from the audience that we have, which is in 30, 40 countries, they all want to know how do we share this with everybody else. I mean, it's great that you do the writing, but maybe we should get somebody to read your writing. I
Read his
mean,
book.
uh, of course, we're gonna we'll have people reading the book, but we need everybody else to hear this and not just hear what happened, but to get a continuation of this narrative and this analysis on an ongoing as things evolve into the future also. So it seems to me this is a new school of thought of a sort in terms of how to look at what's going on and have the courage to push it and to be successful at getting it out in the open. There are a lot of people that have great ideas, but they can't publish a book like that, or they can't get on the national platform. And that's really the issue we've been all suffering from. We're stuck listening to, ABC and CBS and NBC, which to them, it's like, it's us and them, the Palestinians being them, and us being the Israelis. And people get tired of that kind of a rapport. So just an idea, of course.
no, thank you. I appreciate it. I mean, I think it comes down to something that you spoke about. I mean, to be perfectly honest, there's a lot of people who are speaking about this with far more profundity and far more insight than me. They just don't have book deals with Knopf. And so, I think one of the things I bring to the table, for better or worse, that there's that multiplier effect of having that. But I will say that one of the things that I've seen and has been one of the few sources of hope for me over the last, especially the last 6 months when I've been on tour for this book, the generational shift is really quite stunning. When I would talk to um, older family members in my family about writing this book, um, I would get a lot of, "Hey, you really shouldn't do that." Right? There was a lot of, and I don't think it's coming from a place of cowardice or anything like that. I think it's coming from a place of experience. But there was a real sort of, trepidation about something like this, and I understand that. And then I go talk to high school kids, college students, and there is nothing in this book that they find even remotely revolutionary. They are at a different place of thinking, and so it's giving me quite a bit of hope as to what's coming down the pipeline. Um, and it's actually it's quite gratifying to see that take shape and to know that that's coming.
Great. We have some people on the panel now from the audience. And let's start with David. David, if you can tell us who you are, where you are, and what you have in mind.
Well, thank you very much. I'm David Knopper. I'm from London, Canada. And Omar, I read that book. It was incredible. And I would agree with Fossil had said that something like a program would be incredible, because what you've addressed there, nobody else has addressed that. My question is around consequences. And you talked about the lack of consequences for the individual. And I get that, and I see that here. And you mentioned that if the Western journalists were allowed into Gaza, that that would change the individuals, or maybe their perspective, or how they're reacting. So the question is, would that change the institutions? And it's sort of, I think that the institutions are so fixed because of Zionism and Christian Zionism, and intertwixt with the American government. And so they are protecting and providing political and protection from international law, and the military power for Israel to go ahead and do these things without consequences. And you gave the example of the Arab states that have been timid because they fear, if they do something. But if that protectionism for the Americans was not there, then I don't know that we would be at where we're at right now. And so why is the American government like that? And so can you address the Christian Zionism, the Zionism intertwining, and the larger effect that it has on the bigger picture and on the institutions? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate it. So there's a number of questions there. I think to address one of your first ones, at an institutional level, I don't think there's any change until change is forced. And in fact, I think the day when Western reporters are finally let into Gaza and can describe the scale of the horror in ways that Palestinian journalists, like I said in the previous interview, have been describing since day one, it almost reinforces the lack of change, because it fits in with a particular kind of narrative where, while the awful thing is happening, we all kind of look away and feign ignorance, and it's all so complicated, and they've been fighting for thousands of years, and whatever the sort of narrative contrivance might be. But then once the awful thing is done, our sense of self demands that we impose this very apologetic narrative of acknowledgement after the fact. But the after the fact part is the crucial part. And so if anything, I think it'll sort of reinforce the way in which these institutions work. What forces change is the force that comes with people actually pulling their subscriptions, or protesting, or writing angry letters to the editor, which again, as sort of like quantum phenomena individually, me pulling my subscription from the New York Times is doing nothing, but there is a cumulative effect. And you see it in the changing coverage, even before these journalists have access to Gaza. And in fact, with respect to journalism, it's one of the most clear-cut examples of how that is working. Because you see it in the headlines every single day, right? You see, okay, we're going to acknowledge that this population is being starved to death, but we're also going to use headlines like "Starvation finds Gaza," as though starvation was driving around using Google Maps or something, right? Like you see it. It's clear as day in front of you at any moment where this institution is with respect to the risk calculus spectrum. And the work then is to move it along to a place where it feels like there are consequences for describing the forced starvation of a people in the most abstract terms possible. With respect to what you said about sort of US support, and I think that there has, at least in my experience and during my lifetime, always been this effort to compartmentalize Palestine as this sort of special case. There was a book written about it, The Palestine Exception. And I think that is a crucial thing, particularly for mainstream liberalism. I mean, Christian Zionism is at a place where I'm not going to reason anybody out of that position because they didn't reason themselves into it to begin with, and that's sort of a pointless conversation, at least for me to have. But with respect to mainstream liberalism, there's always been this conscious or subconscious desire to compartmentalize Palestine as this lone exception, but it produces real psychic damage because you constantly have to say, either to yourself or to others, yes, apartheid is bad, except in this one situation where it's good as necessary. Yes, segregation is bad, but except in this one case where it's good and necessary. Yes, penning a population in an open-air prison is bad, except in this one case. And over time, there's a cumulative damage one does to themselves when they constantly have to set aside a particular case that is in violation of everything they claim to believe. But I think that nothing that is happening with respect to U.S. support for Israel is outside the confines of what colonialism is. Every one of these narratives applies to the place I live in. This idea that there is a land and it is much, much better used by us than these savages over there. And yes, it's bad that we have to do this, but they're making us do this to them because they won't understand and they won't be reasoned with. There's not a single one of these narratives that is somehow the exclusive property of a patch of land in the Middle East. It's not. It's a hallmark of colonialism. It's a hallmark of any system that has no ceiling. Any system that is insatiable demands these kinds of arguments because there's never enough. There's no such thing as enough. So in a way, it makes sort of perfect sense, at least to me, that a society whose power systems are so rooted in this language and this kind of narrative would be endlessly supportive of an ally that employs the exact same narrative. Would it be different if Palestinians were considered white? Sure. But these narrative constructs are ones that I've seen every time I've picked up a history book.
Thank you. We go next to Wayne. Wayne, please tell us who you are and where you are, what you have in mind. Go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm Wayne Coe. I live in Chatham, New York. I'm an artist. My forefathers were Christian Zionists, Puritans, but my wife's family is indigenous. So they're American Indians. So I obviously have two narratives, which don't reinforce each other. I haven't read your book. I'm dying to. I wrote in the comments, thank you for helping give us language. I also find, reading Marxism and listening to Marxists gives me language to understand corporate capitalism or colonialism, whatever we want to call it. So my question, it doesn't seem like white supremacy, and that's what I saw when I saw all the standing ovations for Netanyahu. I saw essentially white male supremacy uniting with white male European supremacy in Israel. And whether it's Jewish or Christian Zionism seems irrelevant. There's just this complete bonding. And so I'm not sure all the things you say about narrative are true. But unfortunately, for white men like me in America, I'll say the other members of my family, for instance, I'm almost not able to talk about use those terms without them going full level tilt, getting angry, defensive, and hanging up. So I think white supremacy, I don't know. You can also say white supremacy is not a useful term. So my question is, where does that fit in your lexicon? Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. I mean, there's a couple of things that come to mind, and I don't think I disagree with much of what you said. I think the difficulty I have is that, the sort of people you're describing talking to, if I understand you correctly, and it's similar to my experiences, are going to go full tilt anyway. you know, like there might be some magical sort of, you know, platonic arc that I might be able to follow that will get us to the place without resistance, but I don't think that exists. Because fundamentally, no matter what road you take, no matter what line of argument, you are eventually getting to a place where you're asking some variant of the same question, which is, how much of someone else's suffering are you okay with to justify the level of privilege you have? And that question, when you eventually get there one way or another, is going to cause immense rage. Because, you know, I live in a country, and probably much of the world is like this, where the answer to that question is essentially unlimited. I will accept unlimited amounts of someone else's suffering to justify my privilege. So I would say that I suspect it's probably not worth your time to try and find the sort of magical correct approach, because I don't think it exists. Instead, the way that I have tried to think about these conversations, and God knows I have a lot of them. I live in the whitest place on earth. I live in Portland, Oregon. I'm the one guy named Omar in Clackamas County. Like, yeah, I've thought about it instead in terms of being absolutely sure what the hell it is I stand for, and essentially stating that. And so, with respect to something like white supremacy, every system that runs every facet of the society I live in is contaminated with that ideology. And for me to decide not to address it or to glance at it, you know, is not having any real positive effect. And it's also forcing me to couch everything I stand for. And so if I'm losing both in both directions, why bother with this in the first place? Which is my roundabout way of saying, have them go full tilt, man. Like, you know, stand up for what you stand up for. And I guarantee you that that confrontation is coming one way or another, no matter how much we try to avoid it as a society. This is true individually in terms of the conversations you and I might have. And it's true institutionally in terms of, right-wing republicanism is going to a pretty deranged place, but I don't want to confront it. And so I'll just sort of step aside. Well, it's gone to an even more deranged place. And now it's going to come confront you eventually. So I would rather have that confrontation earlier when there might be a chance of finding some sort of common connection than watching it become more deranged and then having to confront it anyway on much, much more dangerous ground. That's the way I think about it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the correct way to think about it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go to Laura.
Hi,
Uh,
thank you.
Tell us about you and where you are, etc.
Okay, I'm calling from North Carolina, though I too am Canadian. And I'm calling to ask a very concrete question about trying to improve media coverage of what is happening in Gaza in local media, that is state and city-based media. And I thought I'd draw on your experience as a journalist. So we've found that we've been pretty much shut out in North Carolina in terms of trying to get news about the genocide in through newspapers. And but we thought we now have a very strong local connection. You know, all politics is local. But with this UG Solutions, I don't know if you're familiar with this company that's been in the media lately. It's providing the militarized security at these very nefarious aid distribution sites and has been involved in actually shooting the aid seekers. And recently, a whistleblower from North Carolina has come out to decry the war crimes that this is part of, this aid distribution scheme, and the fact that so many of the military contractors are from North Carolina itself. So we thought, well, surely we can get some coverage of this very important story right now, as there's a lot of emphasis being placed on this age distribution scheme now. You may not know this if you're not on social media, but I guess I'm wondering what you think, what has worked that you've seen as a journalist where you're trying to increase coverage? So we write to them, we submitted many letters to the editors and op-eds about this UG Solutions, and we're shut out, it seems. And I'm just wondering, as a journalist, what you think, what you've seen work in trying to improve coverage of an issue locally.
Yeah, there's a few things. I should say that, you're playing the game on a fairly hard difficulty setting, right? You're doing this out in North Carolina. I mean, in Portland, we are just seeing the first signs of change, in terms of there being a willingness to even entertain the idea, that any of the things Palestinian journalists have been talking about for the better part of 2 years might actually be happening, or any of that. And that's in Portland, which I suspect is a different political climate than anywhere in North Carolina.
Yes.
So there's that. The other part of it, and this is going to sound incredibly crass, but it's what I think. So here we go. With respect to the murders at the food aid, whatever they want to call them, distribution sites, when this started happening, Palestinians immediately reported it. And they reported it pretty matter-of-factly. This is happening. They are shooting people who are seeking food aid. The same way it happened with the so-called flour massacre and in every one of these situations. The bombing of the hospitals, where initially it was we'd never bomb a hospital, and then every hospital got bombed. But one of the moments where that felt like it changed, at least in this part of the world I live in, was when this Green Beret came out and talked about it, where there was a US soldier, right? And this, I think, is indicative of the reality of the situation, which is we need a white guy to come out and say this. We need somebody who has the credentials of a certain kind of superiority. I know nothing about these human beings who are talking. I don't know this person. I don't know who they are. I don't care. Mm-hmm. There's a certain kind of credit you're afforded, in the same way that I am treated very, very differently if the first thing someone hears is my accent versus if the first thing they see is my name, or if the first thing they hear about me is that I'm Muslim, right? Those are entirely different human beings that they're interacting with. And so this brings me back to the part of your question that I have the most trouble answering, which is like, what do we do, right? My first answer is like, use your privilege. A letter from you, no matter how much it feels like it's not doing anything, has your name on it as opposed to mine.
And he doesn't publish it.
But the thing is, institutions are glacial. They are glacial almost by design. And so, the Democratic Party 20 years from now is going to adopt so many of the positions that they're being asked to adopt right now. The work you're doing is mattering. It absolutely matters. The infuriating thing is that it's going to take forever to see the full fruits of that. Also, you are up against, a very real hierarchy where you might be here above me, but that advertiser who buys the quarter page on A2 every other day is up here, right? And so you are fighting against forces that have more power than you.
But wouldn't you have expected those journalists that you're talking about from Palestine, from Gaza, who are doing this noble work, great work of reporting, and I'm sorry, this would be my last comment, but I mean, wouldn't you have expected a little bit of solidarity? I mean, I've written to newspapers, to editors, everyone, wouldn't you like to cover the targeted killing of journalists and their families? I mean, no, they apparently don't want to, but...
Yeah, the short answer is I would have expected more, and I expected almost nothing. And I got even less than nothing, right? But this again is an example of what I'm talking about. So in Canada, for example, there's the Canadian Journalists for Free Expression. There's PEN Canada. In the US, there's obviously PEN US. And all of these organizations, in my opinion, failed spectacularly. to uphold the single thing that they're supposed to stand for. And you see this across the board, right? You see this with UEFA posted this tweet about the Palestinian football player, the Palestinian soccer player who had been murdered, and it said, it's something like farewell. Like it was the most, as though this guy had, like, you know, it was the end of the movie and he'd wandered off into the sunset or something, right? The journalism organizations early on, and even to this day, did a monumentally terrible job. But their rank and file became aware of this and pressured them to such an extent that if you compare the statements made by any of these organizations today to a year ago, it's like night and day. I mean, Penn US imploded essentially, and their executive director resigned, and now there's these two people who are interim directors. And I feel bad for them because they're being thrown under the bus completely. But they called me up a while back and they were like, hey, we're just meeting with members. At the time, I hadn't let my membership lapse. And, you know, we really wanted to know, like, your advice. And I sat with them and I was like, listen, my advice is to think of the statement that you're going to put out about this in 10 years and put it out today. Because that's effectively what you're doing right now. So I think it's worth keeping in mind that all of these institutions are changing, and they're changing precisely because of what the work that you are doing. It's just taking forever. And that is the most sort of dejection in inducing part of this. But nonetheless, it shouldn't, you know, we continue to do the work because there's no other choice.
Thank you, Omar. We go to Nadia now, and Brian, you're next after that.
Hi, I'm from Bethesda, Maryland, which is right outside Washington, D.C. And I was going to comment on some actions that we're doing here, but I just want to go back to what you were saying about letting foreign reporters in, because you're right, they want to listen to a white person, but there's been multiple UN officials going in. There have been a few diplomats going in. That goes nowhere. But I think to your point about having a white male, over a year ago, our senator from Maryland, Chris Van Hollen, along with Markey, I think it was, actually went to the Rafah border to highlight, here are the aid trucks that are sitting here. And I think that probably did elevate, at least in the press, they were able to report on that. And it's like, there are trucks sitting here at the border. Why are they not being let in? But interesting that we have white European UN people going in, but everything that they report is disregarded. So, I mean, I guess I would question that. But I did want to say that when it comes to, you know, changing the institutions, and as the previous questioner said, I'm with a group that they finally decided they would take their action to the mainstream media. So in Washington, D.C. for the past week, there's been a huge noise demonstration outside this Hall of States building where Fox, NBC, MSNBC, CNN all have their offices in some of their broadcast studios. And the idea being to disrupt their broadcasts so that they would listen. And most of what I've been thinking is more, they use the passive voice, 60,000 were killed instead of Israel killed 60,000 or Israel is forcibly starving. But I hadn't thought about the reframing. I guess it's the reframing the narrative, because from the very beginning, history started October 7th. Not only did it start October 7th, but Hamas killed 1,200, which actually was proven not to be true. But that is such a narrative that there's only one publication I read from Huffington where they just say 1,200 people died, whereas every other mainstream media says Hamas killed 1,200. So they don't even let the truth come in. But apparently some of the mainstream media are going to have some talks, and it's annoying to have the background sirens and noise on Meet the Press and some of the other things. So I guess I'm curious whether you think that's actually going to do anything to change the institutional perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a facet of the moment that Western journalists have sort of mass access to Gaza, I think there's also an element of psychological self-defense that kicks in, because any system of colonialism, any system of violence on this scale can't exist on the strength of the physical violence alone. It needs other forms of violence, It needs linguistic violence, it needs euphemistic violence, it needs the violence of bureaucracy to cover up the reality of the situation. But all of these systems are also very, very well versed in after the fact acknowledgement. I can't remember the last time I went to a literary festival or a literary event of any kind that didn't start with a land acknowledgement. There's this Canadian sketch show that they had a sketch where it was taking place in this literary festival, and the person gets up and just says, before we start, I just want to say that, acknowledge that we are on the unceded territory, indigenous territory. And somebody raises their hand and they're like, so we should leave, right? And they're like, no, we're not doing that. I just wanted to acknowledge it. And I think the moment that a well-respected Western journalist gets to write that story, whether people want to admit it or not, there will be a conscious or subconscious closing of the narrative around that situation. It's all over now. And you'll get, for example, what you got with that New Yorker edition, where the entirety of the magazine was just the story on Hiroshima. That was the entire magazine. Somebody went in and saw the carnage, but implicit in the publishing of something like that is a sense of, and it's done. Bring on the well-practiced narrative of acknowledgement after the fact. I think that's going to be a big part of it. I hope I'm proven wrong. I hope I'm proven way too cynical, and that's not the case. But we also don't have, at least in the United States, the same kind of media environment that might have existed 40, 50, 60 years ago, where you could say something like, oh, if you've lost Cronkite, you've lost Middle America, that sort of thing. It's much more diffuse now. But I do think there is a subconscious desire to have precisely that kind of story, because it'll serve as a kind of bookend to the horrible thing. And now we can all much more safely express the horror that, had we expressed while it was still happening, would have had much more personal ramifications. That's my deeply cynical take on it, but like everything else with this book, and probably everything else I've said today, one way or another, I'm going to be proven right or wrong.
Thank you, Omar. We go to Brian. Brian, unmute yourself, please.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so my name is Brian Drolet. I'm the former director of Deep Dish TV. I retired some years ago, but I was the producer of Fida Kishta's film, Where Should the Birds Fly, about the 2008-2009 Israeli invasion of Gaza. And I'm currently working on a documentary on a specific home destruction in the West Bank, which we hope will bring out some bigger lessons.
We did screen that film here a couple of times, by the way.
Yes, you did. I know. I appreciate that very much. In regard to the media, I would say this, that at the beginning of the Iraq War, I used to ask people, what difference would the coverage make if all the media in the United States was state-owned? And I think you can put that question now about what's happening in Palestine. And I think you could have put it back in the beginning and almost all the way through, almost to the Tet Offensive during the Vietnam War. And I used to watch Walter Cronkite and Eric Sebright every night. And for months upon months upon months, you would get what was essentially the party line interpretation of what the war in Vietnam was about and how it was going. It was only when the military itself began to fall apart and it became clear that the U.S. was losing that war that Cronkite, who was a very good person, changed the story. And so I think we're experiencing the same thing today. And somebody mentioned, you know, reading Marx to find some language. And I think there's a couple things that need to be brought into this question. One is it's not just a matter of colonialism, which in fact it is, but it's a matter of imperialism. And Marx made the statement that capital needs to break down all barriers to its own reproduction. And the other statement he made that I find relevant today is that the capitalist is merely the personification of capital. And in that regard, a person who could sit down and have a discussion with you could go home and be very kind to his neighbors and his children. You know, those images that Judy Chicago did in her artwork of the Nazis having barbecue in their backyard with their friends and children while the smoke was coming out of the crematoriums. They're part of a system, almost like a virus that has dropped into their heads. And now that's not true of everybody. So we see that in our world of human beings, there's both a creative and a destructive tendency. And, you know, in the West Bank just now, where their settlers are running amok and murdering and beating and tearing down people's homes, you have to ask the question, what kind of people are these that would do that? And then you can flip that question, because would would the Palestinians do the same thing if they were in power to the people that did this to them? Because the Jews of Israel are doing to the Palestinians what the Germans did to them. We just haven't gotten to the stage of the gas chambers yet. We have the concentration camp, but not the gas chambers. And that's probably impossible to do it in this stage of history, but it's coming damn close to it. The other thing I want
We have the bombing instead of the gas chambers.
Yeah, exactly.
At this point.
It's murder, however you want to look at it.
And the starvation and the restrictions on aid and food and fuel and everything.
Yeah, there's different methods. But the other thing I think is we need to put this into a much broader context, because the Middle East, had the Middle East primarily been a source of tangerines for the world or avocados, I don't think we would have the same world that we have today regarding these contentions and battles and genocide. The fact is that there's something called oil there. And right from the beginning, oil was a crucial reason for the West to dominate that region. Today, the United States is self-sufficient in oil, so why should it care? Because being the dominant empire in the world means you get to control who gets those resources. And today we have a battle with a real contender, which we haven't had for 100 years, and that's China. And so when people talk about, well, in 20 years down the road, we'll look back at this, I'm not completely convinced that we have 20 years or will have 20 years to look back, because it seems to me that we're in a pre-World War I, pre-World War II situation where there's a battle for markets and there's a battle for resources, and there's no room for opposition. And so Israel becomes an attack dog, which has been from the beginning, or I used to call it a land-based aircraft carrier for US imperialism in the Middle East. It becomes an attack dog that has impunity to do whatever it wants, wherever it wants, as long as the US gives it the okay. And so I think that the contention with China is being also played out in the Middle East. There's a reason why Donald Trump says drill, baby, drill. The Manhattan-sized AI data farm that Zuckerberg is building does not run on solar power. So I'm just saying that you have to put this, what's happening, and both in a bigger context, and ask yourself, what kind of human beings, what kind of a species are we that can do this?
Thank you, Brian. Omar, would you like to provide commentary response? And then I'd like to go to Krista after that to see if she has any other urgent questions or comments. And then we will be wrapping up. I think we've taken a lot of Omar's time. So go ahead, Omar. The floor is yours now.
Sorry, I went on so long.
No. I mean, look, I'm always a little bit cautious with with hypotheticals, right? Like this notion of would the Palestinians do the same thing, or that kind of question. It's interesting in a sort of like as a mental exercise, but I also think of things, for example, like if I could guarantee to every Israeli citizen that they would have the peace that they claim to want so much, they would have absolute peace forever, no more threats of any kind, except that 2 million Israelis have to live in the same way that 2 million Palestinians live in Gaza before October 7th under those conditions. Would anybody take that deal in exchange for complete peace? I don't think they would. I think the hierarchy of human worth that we assign is very real. It's very, very real. What can be done to certain people and what can't be done. But in terms of bigger picture, I mean, again, even if you don't care about Palestinians in the slightest, if you have decided that this is an issue that you're not going to contend with at all, we are in a situation where the concentration of wealth and power is certainly as severe as it's ever been in my lifetime. And almost every facet of colonial power, imperial power, this notion of endless taking, is going to come into play when the billionaire class decide that the part of the world you live in is the most resistant to climate change. Right? I mean, the reason I try to tie these systems of endless taking to more than just the atrocities that are happening in Palestine is not for effect. If that drone just kills that one kid in Palestine and then is never used again, that doesn't make it any less evil. The reason I try to tie it to something wider is to show how modular these systems of violence are. And by the time they start affecting the people at the top of the food chain, the way they're affecting the rest of us, it's going to be entirely too late to salvage anything, including a planet that we can still live on. These are things that keep me up at night, but in terms of hypotheticals, yeah, absolutely, I'll talk your ear off about hypotheticals all the time, but there is a very real genocide happening right now, and I don't care in the slightest about if the tables were turned. The tables are arranged the way they currently are, and it's a brutal arrangement.
Thank you, Omar. I'm sorry we forgot Jack. You were not visible on my screen. Sorry, Jack. Go ahead,
Sorry, I
please.
had my camera off. Don't worry about it. There's no time left, I assume.
No, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Please go ahead.
What was it? So I guess I wanted to ask about communication strategies. So like, obviously you're a journalist, and that means you have a lot of experience and skill in figuring out the best way of how to deliver to a certain audience. I think I noticed that I'm on the younger side of the audience of the thingamajig here tonight. And so like I probably have different media sources and different media consumption than you guys. Not uniformly, but in some ways. And I guess what I'd ask is, do you have any recommendations for someone not only just looking to, do the right thing of talking to others and whatever, but how do you get better at it? Because like I found that the more I knew, the easier it was to be courageous. Like the more confident I could be that I couldn't be shut up with cheap emotional blackmail or shit like that.
Yeah,
Thank-
yeah, absolutely. With the caveat that I can only give you the advice that I would essentially be giving myself in terms of my experiences with this. And some of this might not at all sort of apply to you, but it's just sort of where I'm coming from. There's a couple of things that come to mind. The first is to state the thing. And I know how obvious and trite this sounds, but I really want to dig into this idea because I think a lot of times there's this fear that if you just describe the situation as it is, you will be seen as biased or you will be subject to the automatic. I mean, some of the stuff I get, it feels like someone's just got a macro on their computer and they just hit F10. And I get, but do you support Hamas or like, that sort of thing. And it's fine, whatever. I don't care. But the if I go out and I kill one human being, the full grotesqueness of that act is readily apparent. And the human reaction is unencumbered in any way, morally, ethically, psychologically. If I go out and kill 100,000 people and then I have some very well-dressed people in suits come up to the podium and justify it using the narrative and political force of my government, all of those are barriers against the natural human reaction to a thing. And so simply stating the reality of the situation is a fairly revolutionary act. And that's a depressing thing to say because it shouldn't be. Also, I guarantee you that whatever consequences you face for that, they will be more than offset by the ability to look yourself in the mirror afterwards. And I don't say this about some abstract coward. I say this about me. There have been so many times in my life where I have couched my disgust at something, where I have tried my best to be agreeable. And that's fine. Do that all you want, but not at the expense of the situation as it is. My first piece of advice would be to simply state the thing. The other is, as I have done here today at least once and maybe not enough, be honest about the ways in which you might be complicit in the thing you're indicting. Because one of the natural, instinctual sort of counterattacks to anyone who tries to make a situation like this better in any kind of way is to say, oh, you're a hypocrite. Why don't you care about this? Why don't you care about that? Why don't you care about... By someone who does not care about any of this stuff at all, right? Oh, you're fighting against air pollution and yet you continue to breathe the air? How dare... We live under systems that are designed to be overwhelming. And there are 20 different ways in which I immediately became a hypocrite the second I said anything about any of this. Learn to live with it. We're all hypocrites. I don't know who the hell runs the Zoom platform, but I suspect if I did any kind of digging, I would find something I didn't like. It's always there. And at some point, you have to decide for yourself that the thing you are fighting against is worth the accusation and, in fact, the reality of hypocrisy. So that would be the other thing I would say. I would also say, learn to distinguish between someone who wants to engage in good faith and someone who doesn't as quickly as humanly possible, and don't bother with the bad faith discussion. I was in Wales for a literary festival, and someone in the audience asked a question like, how do we magnify peaceful Palestinian voices? And the really interesting thing is, like, as infuriating as I find that question, I could tell in the way the person was asking it that he was asking it in good faith. The question is fucking infuriating to me for a variety of reasons, but I've also heard it asked in deliberate bad faith, which is with the implication that all these people are savages and there are no peaceful voices, and why aren't you talking about that? And the interesting thing is my answer, or at least part of my answer, is the same regardless. A lot of those peaceful Palestinian voices are probably buried under the rubble, right? But I distinguish as best I can between someone who's asking in good faith, and maybe, I can try to explain to them why I find that question so demeaning, and someone who's clearly working backwards from a position they are trying to put me in so that they can point and say, invalid. And if you want that, more power to you, but I'm not going to engage with it. So keep that in mind as well. And understand that the counterattacks against you will have no respect for good faith or fairness or not being disingenuous or any of that. It will be someone acting with absolutely no desire to change their own mind or even change your mind. They are trying to frighten you. And most of the time they succeed, which is why they continue doing this way. Keep all of that in mind. And beyond that, honestly, you're probably way better versed in this than I am.
I don't know about that, but thank you very much. These are excellent principles. And yeah, thank you for the moral clarity and like the technical clarity as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Jack. Krista, any questions from you or remarks?
Not really
And,
questions. There's been a discussion in the chat about, what kind of that hypothetical that was addressed in the words you just said. And I just want to reiterate and thank you for pointing out that the fear of how any particular population would respond in the future would never justifies what's happening now. And the first step toward a better future is always to just end the genocide and then think about how to move forward. But I just want to thank you, Omar, for modeling. I mean, you're so humble, and not only how you talk about what you've written, but I think you model for others that this whole situation is really not that complicated, that if you come at it with a sense of calm in spite of how horrific it is, that you channel that anger and horror into action, that it really just takes being human, raising questions, asking for accountability. All of that came out not only in the interview that we listened to, but in the comments that you shared with our guests today. So I just want to thank you for that, because sometimes people can feel like they don't know enough, or they're afraid to speak out or say the wrong thing. And I think you've just really shown that all you need to do is have the courage to speak and connect and acknowledge what you're seeing and witnessing each and every day, and that is the greatest path forward, that we acknowledge that and acknowledge that it has to stop, and then there's always a way forward. So I just want to thank you for that, and appreciate how much time you've taken with us and your guests, and to be on our new podcast as well. We really appreciate your time.
This was a privilege. Thank you.
Go ahead, Omar, if you like.
No, I was just going to say thank you for making the space, and thank you for letting me be a part of it. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Krista, if you could take just a very quick look at the Q&A there. There are a couple of things that could be answered, some simple questions if you can answer. Hopefully the people are still on with us.
I'm sorry, I didn't see that the questions were in the Q&A.
In the meantime, if you can answer them in writing, it'll be great, probably, because
Sure.
In the meantime, Omar, there is a hypothetical that actually happened that I'd like to mention. Is the hypothetical is, what if the Israelis were the captives and the Palestinians were the one who captured them and holding them? Would they treat them the same way as the Palestinians captives are being treated by Israel? And as we've seen in Gaza, the Palestinians appear to have been a lot more kinder to their captives and treated them humanely, opposite to what the Israelis have been, how the Israelis have been treating the Palestinian captives. I'm wondering if you have anything to say about that also.
I don't think any human being should be held in captivity, and I don't think there is such a thing as sort of the correct treatment of a captive. We have rules around that, the same way we have rules around what constitutes international law. And I've seen those rules violated left, right, and center for 2 years straight now. We have rules, for example, about why you shouldn't bomb a hospital, and I've seen every hospital in Gaza obliterated. I think for me, it goes one step back from what you're describing. Because I would love to sit here and feel like the most important thing to me would be this sort of one-to-one comparison. But in reality, we don't even get to that place. There are quite literally thousands of Palestinian hostages who are held in Israeli prison camps long before October 7th, and they are never called that. They are detained indefinitely under Israeli policies that effectively allow for that to happen. And so before we even get to a place of talking about how a captive is treated, we are once again faced with this notion that there is a group of human beings who are quite simply considered across the board subhuman and can be treated as such. But yeah, I'm happy to have a discussion about treatment of captives or about implementation of rules and norms and laws. But for the entirety of this occupation, which now is more than 3/4 of a century, getting to that place necessitates engaging with the reality that the entire structure is designed to deem a population subhuman. And so when I watch, Western politicians talk about how grotesque it is that these Israeli hostages should be held captive, I don't think any human being should be held captive. I think it's grotesque across the board. Show me the statement for the thousands of Palestinians. Show me the statement for the one I saw being gang raped by Israeli soldiers. Show me the statement for the children who are being held captive. The idea of they would have done just as bad or something like that, I think is an incredibly powerful and incredibly dangerous narrative device, because it frees oneself from any kind of internal constraint. Because now you're either wearing the boot or you're having your neck stepped on. And if you tell me that I should lift my foot off that neck, well, the very next stage is now it's going to be my neck that's stepped on. And so I'm always very cautious about that kind of framing, for a variety of reasons.
Thank you, Omar. Very, very informative, and thank you so much for taking the time to be with us and for writing that book. And we will be trying to carry the book at the museum in Edinburgh as well as the one in Connecticut. Thank you, Krista, for co-hosting with me, and apologize for dropping out when our internet went down here. We're still kind of figuring out things. I did promise to show the audience a few minutes of the current exhibit we have by Peter Kennard. He's a well-known photographer in London, and his exhibit is called Gaza. Omar, feel free to, if you pressed for time, you can do whatever you like. You can stay or you can leave, up to you. We appreciate your being with us, and I think we got more than we bargained for here in terms of your insight and time. So I will be walking over for just a few minutes and showing this to people.
Thanks so much. I'm going to stick around, but I'm turning off my video.
Sure, that's fine.
Thanks again, Omar.
We're looking here at the Peter Kennard exhibit. I'm going to just get rid of some of the screens off mine so I can see what I'm showing you. So here is here is one of the photos. There's another one in the bottom. I think I need to go back a little bit so everybody can see.
And if you pin Faisal's window by clicking on the 3 dots in his screen, you'll be able to see a larger image.
Okay. So I'm gonna move this here out of the way a little bit so I can give you a better view. So let's zero in on this particular image. This is the American flag bleeding on the Palestinian flag. There's a lot of symbolism involved there. Down below, we have the destruction of Gaza with the Israeli flag flying over it. Up here, we have that. And down below, we have what looks like an American Army medal with hash marks for the number of kills the soldier had. Another image here. Down below, the title of this one is called The Killing Fields. And in the bottom here, we see a picture of a baby, and superimposed over it is a page from the Financial Times. Financial Times has that pinkish color. And on the top is Gaza on the rocks there and over the rubble. On this side of the panel, we have additional, we have another 8 photographs. We start with the one here with the never again and an eraser beginning to erase the word never there on a blackboard. On the to the side, we see a woman in distress with a baby in her arms and the missiles going by. Below here, we see a baby in an incubator and a hand with an Israeli army insignia on it, cutting the feet.
Here are some images of baby, and superimposed over it is a page from the Financial Times. Has that a pinkish color? And on the top is Gaza on the rocks there and over the rubble. On the side of the panel, we have another 8 photographs. We start with the
Quiet. I think Siri.
Faisal, your phone is trying to give us a tour.
Siri interfered with me. Sorry. Here we see a Palestinian flag, and we see what's happening to the red triangle, and we see it bleeding down. So the blood of Palestine is leaking down, but also Palestine, the life of Palestine is being depleted here. And you could think of this as an hourglass also, the hourglass showing that time is running out, the blood is being spilled, and time is closing. In the bottom, we have the Labour, that refers to probably the Labour Party in the UK. And one of my favorite images is the one on top here, which has an image of a baby, and the superimposed on it is the shadow of a flying drone in the sky. It's quite an image, really. And below it, we see an image of a person. We could see the eye, and then you see that the person is in the crosshair of a sniper, something that happens regularly in Gaza. All right, so just while we're at it, I'll show you, this is the view from the museum looking out on Sundas Street. I'm sorry, Dundas Street in Edinburgh. The Dundas Street is, and particularly this block we're on, is considered the art address for Edinburgh, the most number of galleries and art establishments on this block. We have artwork here from different artists. We don't have time to go through the detail. I'm just going to go by it. A lot of you recognize the Samia Halabi Venetian Red. I've seen this particular Morning Spring. It's spelled M-O-U-R, and on the floor, my signature map on the floor. Hard to show you that. I just flip the computer down. This is a 7-meter long map of Palestine from 1948 that has all the Palestinian villages before Israel destroyed them and renamed them. Quick pass through additional artwork here, sculptures, more art up there. Prints for sale. The sculpture here, artwork, and this is a sculpture of Hussam Abu Sofia, was made by a local Scottish artist by the name of Amanda Adler. We have additional sculptures in the middle, Palestinian thobes, another Palestinian thobe. Artwork on the window here being lit by outside light through translucent paper. More artwork, a Jenga setup here. Artwork, photography. We have a fashion display here from a designer by the name of Hama Hinnawi from Chicago. And there's a beautiful white shirt embroidered with embroidery in it and an embroidered skirt. That's available for purchase and order from the designer directly in Chicago. Anybody would like to do that, please contact us. We'll give you the information. Finally, there's another exhibit hall here. And we just go quickly through it. If you're in the UK, this is easy to visit. We hope some of you who are outside of the area would also come and visit. We have this painting of the cyclamen flower in Palestine. And finally, the big Nabil Anani 3-meter long painting that's titled Utopia. Okay, so thank you everyone for sticking around with us here, and we still have 118 connections with you. Very impressive engagement. Thank you so much, and thank you, Krista, and thanks to Omar again. And we look forward to seeing you next week. We do not have any special programming on Sunday tomorrow. However, many of you have the link to the regular Sunday webinar with doctors in Gaza. This is a live connection to Gaza where we listen to some of the local doctors about the conditions. That it's a weekly program that is put on by Doctors Against Genocide. If you don't have the link,
I put a link to that in the chat, by the way, in case for those of you who don't have it.
Excellent, Krista. Thank you so much. Makes life so easy for everyone. All right. Thanks, everyone. We look forward to seeing you next week. As we say at the end, ma salama, goodbye in Arabic.
Ma salama. Thanks, everyone.